what I wanted to talk a little bit about was how we've had a very difficult time in Ottawa dealing with appropriate ground-oriented solutions to housing in our downtown core. We seem to have been successful in dealing with certain things like apartment buildings and with lower density areas, for example, out in the suburbs. But the minute we start to deal with ground-oriented townhouses in the downtown area, we seem to import some of our suburban models into our downtown area.
And this is an example right here, I guess.
Well, this is one example. One of the things that happens, as you can see, you've brought the higher density here, but you've created in many ways landscaping that probably is not used by the inhabitants and actually is a bit of a maintenance problem rather than something that's enjoyed by the community. Traditionally, what's happened in downtown cores is that we've tended to group our areas into parks that people actually use. What we've done with this type of approach is we've created a suburban house that's probably the same size and form, but with a postage stamp sized lot, with the adjoining land not really being usable by the inhabitants and possibly is a requirement under the zoning bylaw. So I think that the solutions that we should aim towards should not be so concerned with respect to preserving the green space immediately surrounding the house itself, but perhaps trying to reserve the space in a separate block area. I'll be able to show some examples of appropriate solutions. So here we have the situation where because we have never really been challenged with the urban townhouse high-density model, we can deal with apartment buildings, but we can't seem to deal with single-family homes. We want to put a garage in front, we want to put grass, and we want to put sloped shingle roofs. So what really distinguishes this type of development and the one across the street here and the one over in the other area from similar developments in Canada? And I really can't see much difference except the fact that we're downtown where there are buildings that go up 20 stories.
Now, what was the reason, what do you think, what were the underlying reasons for this? I mean, is this a policy decision? Is this a decision by the builder feeling that he could or she could get more money for building a property like this than building an apartment building, let's say?
Well, there's a variety of reasons. One of the ones is that we have gone through a fairly strong recession, so land values in the downtown area got quite depressed. So what will happen is people will develop according to the land value. If this land value is very high, the pressure would be put on for density. Because the land value probably at the time was less, then one can afford to do a smaller development. Unfortunately, what happens is that as we're concentrating our efforts into developing the downtown core, these buildings will stay for us for 30 to 40 years. They'll outlive various cycles of the recession. So the developer, in many ways, I think, has probably made a very good effort given the variables they have to work with. The other problem we have are issues related to zoning, where zoning allows this type of development to take place. And perhaps if we used more urban design-oriented bylaws where we said, one can build here, but it has to be a certain density. If not, it's preferable that it probably remain a parking lot until the determined time that we can build the appropriate development.
But with apartment buildings, I mean, I think one of the reasons why people don't like living in cities is because the only choice they have are either apartment buildings or upper middle class homes, which are usually too expensive. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything in the middle.
This is the difficulty, and like I said, it's if you see the high density that's reflected, when you live in an apartment building, you're all of a sudden dependent on technology. You have to use an elevator.
That's right.
It's so much nicer to be able to have like a stacked townhouse concept. In fact, many studies have been done that shows many of these towers you see, if they were placed on their side, probably could be walked up to and have the same density. The difficulty is that we really haven't managed to deal with that. Many American cities that are older than ours, for example, Boston, the Back Bay area, or the downtown, or downtown Philadelphia, have had probably a longer tradition of dealing with the urban house. And some areas in Boston are fabulous. You'll get houses with no landscaping, perhaps interior gardens, that are up 4 or 5 stories. They're brick. They're very, very appropriate solutions to high-density living that incorporate concepts of walkability and don't make you dependent on a mechanical system.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the history about this, because it seemed that for a number of years in Canada, beginning, I guess, in the 50s and the 60s, that there was a push to move people outside of the city core and put them into what's now known as suburbia. And suburbia continues to grow, and it continues to grow unabated. And we've seen some successes with Toronto, for instance, with plans by David Crombie, for instance, to keep people in the city, to building more and more apartment buildings and so on. And I guess my question is, do cities like Ottawa have they let suburbia take over the agenda, so to speak?
Well, I think that in Ottawa is a very special case. One is that we're not a very large city like Toronto, so our land values are much lesser. Then we have another factor, which is the green belt. So our suburbia is farther away. So you have this core which is built up. Now what's happening is that it's in vogue or in style to live downtown. That is happening for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is demographics. As people get older and they become the so-called empty nesters, or even people with families, they realize that living downtown has a lot of amenities and quality of life that doesn't come within suburbia. Now the question is, can we be doing suburbia better? Because suburbia in a way becomes very homogeneous, it's very sterile, it's all the same types of houses. We don't allow corner stores, we don't allow little barber shops or service stores. So the reason people are escaping in a way the suburban solution is not because there's something wrong with suburbia as a potential, but that suburbia isn't being handled right. So if we could use some of the great things that work in the downtown and do that in the suburbia, we probably wouldn't have this real strong need to want to live downtown. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Here in Ottawa, we did the architects did a charrette, which is kind of a design exercise for Kent Street, because at that time the mayor, Jackie Holtzman, wanted to encourage housing in the downtown core, especially on the Kent Street area, and is very proudly looked upon as being very successful for encouraging housing to come in, which it's a very, very laudable goal. The problem is that the kind of solutions that we have are problematic with respect to real urban solutions. And that's, I think, the nature of the kinds of things we're talking about. It's not the intention, but it's the actual solution. Imitating housing that was here when this was a suburb. Because at one time this was a suburb, and many of the single-family homes you see in this area with small plots of land are kind of inner suburban solutions. So all of a sudden now, though, as you can hear from the traffic and the intensity of activity, we're no longer an inner suburban, so we really should be looking for more appropriate solutions.
I'll ask you a political question. Because we've seen in the government, especially in the Ontario government, is that we've seen a change in policies that goes from the center core, and now we see that the agenda has been switched to suburbia. And I'm wondering how that's affected urban design and urban renewal at all.
Well, I believe that the actual official policy, and I might be corrected here, is for intensification, and that's within the official plan of the region. So the question is increasing our density within the urban area to actually, many ways, mitigate sprawl. In Canada, we have a lot of developable land, but what happens is that quite often, unless we start to see a sea change, which I think we're seeing the beginning of wanting to move back downtown again, that intensification, you can have all the policies you want, but if people don't want to live downtown, then that's another issue. Now, I believe now that when you do project, the intention is to make it more density. But then you're creating more density, but still requiring little backyards, little side yards. So how intense can you really get with these kinds of bylaw limitations?
But who's setting those bylaws? Is that provincial politicians? Is that regional politicians? Is there consultation at all with people such as
luckily
yourself?
here in Ottawa we're having an amalgamation, I think, of all these different municipalities, because there's 12, if not more, different visions as to what solutions are. Some of them these cities are purely in suburban areas. Some are more in the downtown areas. So hopefully now with the entire group coming together, we will be able to have an appropriate approach that deals with the complexities of the downtown and the suburban. I would think that the province wants to leave a certain amount of autonomy for the municipalities in each area to deal with their own problems, because they're quite different from Northern Ontario communities, from Toronto communities to Ottawa communities. But I guess what we have to do here, in the particular case of Ottawa, is probably involve the professionals such as architects, planners, designers in the solution. Unfortunately, I've found that politicians tend to expand the scope of their involvement quite often and get involved in decisions that probably they have not been trained to deal with. So, for example, a planning committee within the City of Ottawa is only elected politicians. And if you're an elected politician, you have to be, that is your profession, because you can't do it part-time. And I know there's been dialogue and controversy about that. But my feeling is planning committees should be composed very strongly of all the players that are involved in the process. That includes the community groups, absolutely, the architects, the professionals, even the business groups who all have a stake in the development of a healthy and vibrant downtown. And then when the politics comes into it, then deal with that within the city council level, but not necessarily at the planning level.
So, describe for me. I mean, how would you build fill? How would you treat the empty parking lots that we have, and how would your designs change from what we've seen over there?
I think what I would try to do is, one of the things that I would try to reflect is the fact that we live in a northern climate. Our bylaws say absolutely nothing about sunlight, and that is a tragedy when you look at the models that we've imported. In fact, you stretch it even into the big box stores. What's the difference between a big box mall in Ottawa and a big box mall in California? The only difference is we wear winter coats up here in the winter. It's essentially the same landscape. So I think we have to take a look within ourselves, realize that we're within a northern latitude, try to orient our buildings so that we create a proper environment, not only for the inhabitants of the building, require a certain amount of sunlight within each habitable space, make sure our buildings do not cast shadows, try to base our bylaws on quality rather than on quantity. That would then, in a sense, require a certain maximum form and density within which you can build and still have all the streets have a certain amount of sunlight. So you define a bit of an envelope that way. Then you would try to be as dense as possible. Of course, the other issue that I'm very concerned about is that we don't also deal with our streetscape. We end up, because of the city laws require 7 or 8 feet from the lot line, and that just becomes grass. Well, why not make it sidewalk? Why not make it where people can play, kids can play, and put some chairs and other things there? So get away from this very high maintenance sod, which is really only there visually and is never really used. So the other thing I would do, you'd be fine of this magic formula because of the size of our streets, that you really wouldn't be able to build too high before you're starting to cast shadows. So my guess would be that the development would result in not having to use elevators. It would probably be accessible in terms of walking, and you would try to create commercial spaces on the ground floor so that you don't have this feeling of wanting to hurry by, which is one of the things that happens quite often in the downtown areas where you do these large buildings that are 200 feet long and you have one entranceway. Well, what do you do between those 200 feet?
That's right. You walk as fast as you
can. You walk as
yeah.
fast as you can.
Especially when it's 30 below.
Yeah, and that creates environments quite often that people just don't want to linger in. And what you want to create, and I think the popularity has been reflected in the past, is people want to linger. People want to sit at a sidewalk cafe. They want to get up and they want to walk around and they want to look inside stores. So if we can create that kind of environment, that's the kind that I would like to be involved in creating, not replicating Canada in our downtown core.